Amanda Gregg.
Hi, Andrew. Great to meet you. Great to see you.
You as well. You are describe your faculty role here at Middlebury College.
Sure. So I am an assistant professor in the economics department. This is actually my seventh year at Middlebury, so this is like the big year, the big tenure review year. So that's a very exciting step for me. And in the economics department, I teach courses on statistical methods and also economic history.
So I'm going to ask you real quick. So you say economics, but sometimes I say economics. Is it one or the other, or is it both ways?
It depends on the day for me.
The economy or the economy. So we're talking today about a working paper that you collaborated on, and I've read it. And before we start talking about the paper, I just want to make sure that I leave some space to recognize the trauma that this research sort of indicates was going on, the lives lost during all of this late 18th century slave trade between Africa and North America. And it must have been very, very difficult for you to research and look at some of this data and publications that you looked at.
Yeah, certainly it's a new experience for me with this project, really having to like take a break from the reading and having to take a moment to really think about the meaning of the data from time to time in a very different way. I mean, the rest of my research is about, I would say, like much more boring and less human topics like finance, and you don't need to really a break from staring at balance sheets except to get a cup of coffee. But with this work, reading the secondary literature and reading about life on a slave ship and what the experience of a slave ship would have been is really tough. And I don't know if I've really found the right way to deal with that psychologically as a researcher. And there's also a balance, I think, between being upset and traumatizing yourself doing the work and then being too disconnected. And so I think that's sort of a continuous battle to make sure that you find the right balance. And a really big part of that, I think, for me is to always make sure to engage with the primary sources, right? And keep an eye on the people.
One of the things that you talk about in some of the introductory material of the working paper, which is shared both in the Discord chat channel, and then we'll follow up with later on Twitch as well, was early on when people started looking at some of these things, it was a big picture that they looked at for how did human beings get trafficked from one side of the world to another. Do you think that science and research has changed to allow this sort of micro one ship research that you've been doing?
That's such a great question. I think that there's sort of two dimensions. So one is if you are a scholar and you want to understand the big picture, it absolutely makes a lot of sense to start with just the big picture and think about overall volume and what does a moment like this mean to humanity overall. And with that big picture established, then I think one is free to begin to consider what's under the hood and what could be missing in just a big picture like that. And you're absolutely right. On the other hand, we are in a moment where technology allows us to think about this micro dimension in a much broader way. And we're certainly not the only project in this literature or in this subject that's able to think about that micro level. I think our major contribution is this amazing detailed source about one particular typical slave ship. But for me, as an economic historian, in general, in my work, I just think this is such an exciting moment to try to do quantitative work about the past because the technological tools have made a lot of large scale projects that describe individual people or individual firms feasible. And that's very cool because you have both the detail and scale.
In this paper, which describes from the ship's records and the logs and some writings from the ports where they stopped, you were looking at what the captain, how much time the captain was spending in these different
Mm.
places where they would land, and what you can deduce and research and conclude from that time, because it was the economic, well, not from, if I'm understanding the paper right, there was a lot of pressure to get in and get out quick, to get there, get the merchandise that you were trading for and buying, and get it back to where you were going to be selling it, to keep that cycle going. And so you were looking at one ship's
Mm.
captain and their experience and their work. Is that an accurate reflection of the of? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, no, you're reading that perfectly, and, the story that we tell, if you really take a moment and reflect on it, is a horrible story, because what generates that time pressure is that a slave ship is a ticking bomb, because as soon as an enslaved person, is aboard the ship, there's a deadly environment and they start to die. And so that's why the ship has got to get out of there. And that is a horrible thing to reflect on. And that's what's underneath the story. And what we're able to see also, that's one dimension that's very it's really hard to write about, frankly. Um, and I think, on the other hand, what's really special about what we're able to see in this data is not only just that decisions of the captain and what he's doing as he's moving along the African coast, but what's always been like a holy grail in this literature, to learn a lot more about what the Africans are thinking and about that dimension of the trade. And so in this data set, what we're able to observe are, in some sense, two sides of the trade in great detail. An important aspect of the trade that we haven't talked about yet in this conversation, but I think that's important to understand what I'm going to say next, is that what we understand about the way that the slave trade was actually conducted along the African coast is, as these European ships were moving along the coast and landing in ports, the way that they actually transacted for enslaved people was not with money currency. The trade was actually based on an exchange of a basket of goods. And what we can see in our data set is the entire composition of the basket of goods that was exchanged. And also, what's very special is that we see the identity of the person on the coast, the African or the European merchant with whom the ship transacted. And so we can make inferences about how that basket changes with the increasing time pressure, how that basket changes based on the characteristics of the enslaved person, and how that basket is different based on the characteristics of, well, what we can know about the person with whom they're transacting on the coast.
In the paper, the basket is sometimes referred to as a bundle, and that's one of the
Bundle.
data points you've got going on there. Is like, what is in what, this is a horrible thing, but it's one of the things that you've been looking at. What is in a bundle that you would trade for a human life?
That's such a great question. What's it's all kinds of stuff. It's all kinds of stuff. And one of the big debates is this bundle just standing in for currency, like there's a different currency, or is it barter? And we don't take a stand on this, because actually I think that what we argue is that it's really neither extreme. So what's in this bundle, a major portion are textiles. And what's very cool about textiles is that in, for example, the Kingdom of Luongo, which this specific slave ship is sitting in the port of Luongo in our story, um, textiles did function somewhat like currency, and different patterns of textiles can have different values. And Europeans know this, but they don't know exactly which textiles are going to work in this way and be received as valuable. So the ship has a whole mess of textiles, and it's experimenting, right, as the trade continues. And as the trade continues, textiles start to make up an increasing portion of the bundle as they're trying to increase the value to get the heck out of there and complete the transactions that they need. So textiles are in there, and textiles they perhaps have a use, but we think they function mostly as a kind of quasi currency. But also in the bundle are guns, alcohol, weapons, mirrors, cooking tools, all kinds of stuff is in this bundle. So it's sort of a quasi currency substitution, but also a quasi barter trade.
That's
And we can take these apart and map these bundles, and they're really quite fascinating.
it's something that I never it's one of those things where your mind sort of shies away from even thinking about how that might work in the real world. So it's fascinating to realize that it's not here's a pouch of coins, which might not have any reference in the economy that you're bringing that resource into, but it is fabrics, materials, and weapons that you could use. One of the other things that jumped out at me from the working paper was this: who would meet them at the port? Who were they trading with? And you mentioned that some of the people maybe had an honorific in their name and they were accompanied by someone who didn't. And what did that say about the people? Was one a European and their African collaborator? What did you sort of learn from who was doing the trading at the port?
I think that my collaborator knows a little bit more about some of those details on the ground, but I can speak to something about this idea of some of the African traders in particular having honorifics or titles. So, I mean, this often meant that they have a essentially an office in the state, in the African state of in the kingdom of Luango. So, and these folks could be entitled to certain kinds of tribute alongside the transaction. And we sort of have gone back and forth about what this can mean for the trade if someone has a title or honorific. So, in on the one hand, they are a known quantity, and so perhaps they enjoy some advantages in trades. And so perhaps the composition of the bundle that we would see might be different, or the total value of the bundle might be different. But also we know that the bundle that we see does not include certain kinds of tribute that would have been paid on the side, especially alcohol. And so that changes some of the interpretation that we have. But we think that this dimension is really totally fascinating. And it's what's interesting, I think, what my co-author and collaborators pointed out is that, you can actually enumerate the list of office holders in that state, and they don't necessarily all appear in this trade. And like, what do we make of this? It's not clear. We're sort of like poking at a really big subject with this little snapshot that we're able to see with this one ship.
So you mentioned the name of the ship, and I'll have you pronounce it. It's a French name.
Oh God. I've always called it the Bonne Société. I don't speak French.
That's another
That's Annie's
department at
purview.
Middlebury.
Yeah. Hush.
Um,
Yeah.
and what you described, the captain's name is Captain David. Is that correct?
Gabrielle David. Yes.
Gabrielle David, and he becomes in the working paper sort of the main character of this story, his adventures and what he's doing and how he's trying to make money from this. And then you also described that there was a slave rebellion on the ship at one point. That a bunch of the cargo, the people, jumped overboard, but it wasn't. It didn't happen more than once. It was just once on this particular ship, unlike other ships.
Yeah. And it was, I mean, a moment. And, this is one of those, again, those moments where you have to sort of stop and, I kind of jolt yourself awake, because like when they say it's a slave revolt, it's not really a revolt, right? I mean, it's actually it's a horrible moment of enslaved people jumping overboard. And you know I don't- it's it takes place sort of on the way to their final destination. So when they've left the coast, but as we write about this, I don't know. It's so hard to wrap your mind around and walk away from right at the end of a workday, and I think convey with the right gravity in a paper like this, which is basically an economics and historical exercise. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a real challenge for us.
These people had to make the choice between an uncertain, horrible future or perhaps dying in this choice to jump overboard. And to be
Exactly.
faced with that
Yeah.
choice is unthinkable, and yet it was a regular occurrence. The other thing that you mentioned, and this is sort of an overarching thing about the slave trade, was that the balance between how many can be quantified as being taken on board ships and then how many arrived at their destination alive. And if I'm remembering the numbers, it was about 2 million people who died on the journey in total at this time that you're talking about in this window that you describe in the paper.
I don't remember the number, but it's
It's
an enormous number.
it's it's
It's a number you can't fathom.
it's overwhelming to think about the realities of some of the things that are talked about. And it's mind blowing. The other thing that it seems, and this was all the paper, the time of the paper, the working paper describes is after the Revolutionary War, and that during this time, the value of this human resource increased. Is if I'm reading the paper right, you sort of describe that the value went up.
Mhm.
What does your research show about maybe why or how did the price of a human go up during that time?
Oh, I think I may pass on this question
Yeah.
because it's a really complicated question. Um, It has a lot to do with, worldwide geopolitical events and the coming of the Industrial Revolution and what's going on in shipping, and so
So
I'll defer that
So
question
no,
for now.
that's fascinating to
Yeah,
think about because you're looking at
yeah,
as a researcher, you need to find one thing that you can write about, that you can report on, that you can study. And how do you do that as a researcher with something that is so big like this, with so many
right.
things to talk about? How do you decide what's going to be beneficial and interesting for you as a scientist and helpful for our better understanding of human history and how economics work? How do you pick something to study?
I think humility is really helpful in that enterprise. Um, you have to know. First of all, it helps to really know a lot about the context and to know a lot about what is already established, and to sort of have a healthy trust in what's already established, but also a critical eye to think about what may still be missing. And when I say humility, what I mean is that we can't always contribute everything. We can't solve every problem or answer every question. I think that a real challenge for even for our students writing final papers, for all of us, definitely for me as a researcher, is figuring out like the proper boundary of a given exercise or a given paper, because you want to ask a question that is large enough in size that is interesting, but is also small enough in scale that you can complete it. And this particular exercise, this paper, I think is a nice and clear boundary. And I think we have our eye on where that boundary is located because, on the one hand, this is an amazing source. It's so rich knowing all these details of these transactions, knowing who they're transacting with, being able to see the letters of the captain, and we have additional information, because this ship eventually starts to take on water, so there's an insurance case when they finally land, and that generates an enormous amount of documents. And so on this hand, we're so excited about the detail, but we have to maintain our humility, right? This is one ship, and it's a typical ship, which allows us to go a little further than we would otherwise. But it is one ship and one experience. And so what we always have our eye on is how, to what degree is this a typical experience? To what degree is this an atypical experience? How does that influence what we want to say more broadly? And are there, for future steps in this project, one thing that's going to be really important, I think, to getting our story right is understanding um, what other ships were there with them in the port, for example, or what else is going on in the training environment. And there are ways to get at that because other scholars have done some of this broader work and have done and constructed some of these larger databases, which help us see how our one data point fits in with this whole story. So that's a really long answer to your question because your question is like the hardest question in the universe for a researcher, right? How do you decide on like the right size of question? I think that's very hard.
And that's what your students face as well when you're like, write a paper about something that interests you. And so that's they come, they get some advising, and you help them in your teaching work.
Yeah, and I smile at them and I pretend like I'm a real expert in doing that, but it's like really really hard. And I don't think one ever escapes, right? Like trying to figure out where the boundary is. And I think that where you have to, as a researcher, where you have to sort of go to sleep at night is like, okay, this is one paper in a project, and the project goes on forever. And I think this is a project that's going to keep Annie Ruderman and I busy for a long time.
I have one, well, there's many questions, but the last little question
There's
I'll
many
ask you
questions.
specifically about the paper is one of the things that you describe in there was the records that you were looking at. The data shows that they would get a visit from one of their business partners at the port, but they wouldn't keep coming back over and over. Different people would come, and it didn't seem like they have regular customers, if I'm remembering that part of the paper.
Oh, it's actually, I think it's a mixed story, which is very interesting because one thing we're able to see because we know the identities of the Africans and Europeans with which the ship transacts, we know which of those folks only comes to the boat once, and we know which of those folks come to the boat more than once. And in fact, there are sort of two big groups, right? There's a group of traders that come only once and we never see them again. And there's also a group that comes multiple times. And so we're able to actually think about, is there anything different about those traders that come multiple times? And maybe if I could show, um, this is going to be a little awkward, but I could show some pictures if you'd
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
of
I will
sort
get
of
ready
what that
to.
looks like. This is really low tech here. I'm literally going to show some pictures from the paper because I wasn't sure what direction we were going to go in, but here I'm showing the paper, and what's up here actually are just little bar charts that show you, if you look at the second one, the bottom, the number of days, so different days on which a certain seller on the coast would appear in the data set. And so you see on the left-hand side, there are a whole bunch that only appear on one day. And so we think of that as like one day of transacting and then we never see them again. But then there's all these other folks that come over and over and over again. And there's one of our main characters here. We have one of these sellers that comes to the boat on 25 different days. So that's very interesting. And
That
it has some intersection with these folks that we said have honorific titles,
so
but
there are
not totally.
greater visit, yeah, and more visits from the people who have an official title. That seems to indicate like that's their. What that's it's really strange to think about, like to imagine what that means for the work that they do,
Yes, it
and
is very interesting to think about, yeah, what that means for, like, in terms of, like, what does it mean to have a title? Yeah.
and how and there's so many other things that layered, as you mentioned. This is just one little piece of this much grander, really awful time in human history that
Yes.
was happening in Western
Mhm.
society. I want to ask this a big to take a step back and a breath from the. Please read the paper.
Yeah,
The people
yes.
who are watching, it's fascinating. It's disturbing. It's really important. Great information to have and add to our whole study of how we understand who we are as a country, what our history is, what we're based upon. Even here in Vermont, the textile factories that were turning out some of these textiles that were then used in these bundles. Perhaps it's all that sort of stuff. To anyway. I don't want to go too far down that. But I want to ask you, as an economist, are economics the
Mm.
real fabric of our society?
Yeah, just lend end with something light.
Yes.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm an economic historian, so I get to give a wishy-washy answer a little bit. Well, let me rephrase. I get to give um, a a bit of an interdisciplinary answer, which is like economics is an incredibly powerful set of tools for thinking about people. Economics tells you to have a suspicion that when you are looking at data, for example, from the past, that the patterns that you see exist for a reason. And often that reason might be boiled down to a set of people doing the best they can, subject to some constraints. And what the historian's lenses, I think, about in that sense is figuring out what do they want and what constraints are they facing. And that's really the way I think about economics explaining people. I mean, I'm very far from an ideologue, but I think that one should be careful to dismiss economics too quickly. You see a lot of dismissal, like, oh, well, economics is very silly because people aren't rational. Uh, okay, but if I reduced economics to saying that oftentimes you do the best you can, subject to some constraints that maybe only you understand, with room for you to screw up from time to time, that actually starts to sound pretty reasonable. And it is amazing to me as a historian to look at sources that are really old and that are about all kinds of different moments in time with all kinds of different people of all kinds of different skill levels. And uh, a lot of the economics I've learned in school, like it actually just works. And this is especially true for me in my work on firms. Like firms just behave. Even in old historical sources, dusty archives, you'd be surprised how well things actually work according to the economics I learned in college and graduate school. So is economics like the fundamental human fabric? Well, I mean, it's not money, but I think like the idea um, that I guess having like a really positive view of humanity, that people are doing something for a reason, and that reason might be knowable. I think, yeah.
Thank you so much for taking some time to talk about this. You've added to this discussion and an understanding of this business that is just so unthinkable. I respect and I want to make sure that I say you lived with some stuff that was really, really hard to think about. And I admire that and thank you for doing that work to help us better understand this time in our history. It must have been very difficult some nights.
Very, yeah. Thank you for acknowledging that. But I mean, the burden I carry, right, is just reading some hard things, right? I think that, the what actually happened, of course, is a whole nother matter. So, but thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about this work that we really believe in and we think is really important.
I'm going to stop the stream now and then we'll say goodbye on Discord here. Thank you.
Thank you.